Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining this video. In this video, we're going to be talking about Trackio from the very beginning. What Trackio is, how you can use it to track your machine learning experiments, and towards the end of the video, we'll talk about how your AI agents could use Trackio. And this will be useful if you are running machine learning experiments autonomously, if you have a fleet of Cloud Code agents running machine learning experiments on auto research, or if you've run your machine learning experiments manually, but you want to point an AI agent to the training logs, which you can easily do with the Trackio CLI, which we'll get to. All right, with that, let's dive in. All right, so getting started with Trackio. So Trackio is a Python package, which means you can install it with UV or with pip, your favorite PyPy installer, or you can even install it from source if you want the latest changes. Once you have it installed, it's very easy to get started. You'll init a project. So before you start your training run, you'll call trackio.init right over here, and then you'll give it a project name, and then you'll provide some sort of configuration. This is of course optional, but you can provide a config that has hyperparameters, any other metadata that you want to associate with that training run. Then throughout your training loop, all you'll do is you'll just call trackio.log and log the metrics in real time. So this syntax will probably feel pretty familiar if you've used weights and biases or any other training library before. In fact, Trackio is designed, the API is designed to be identical to weights and biases in most cases. So you can actually, for example, if you already use the WAN-B Python client, you can just import Trackio as WAN-B, and your experiment code will not change, and neither will the tracking code. So everything else will kind of just remain the same. Now, one big difference though is weights and biases runs in the cloud by default. Trackio, on the other hand, is designed to be local first. So this will be very, very fast. Everything will be logged locally in your training environment by default. Okay, and then you can actually launch this dashboard by running Trackio show. So all of the data will be saved in a local SQLite database, and then when you run Trackio show, you get a very nice dashboard that displays all of those metrics. And so you can see different runs that I've logged here. You can see the system metrics that could be logged. You can also log things like images, audio files, tables of data, and the syntax is pretty much all exactly the same as the weights and biases syntax. One interesting thing about Trackio is the alert system. And so Trackio has the concept of alerts, and these alerts think of it as the equivalent of like printing debug statements, right, in your code, but it has to do with metrics. So for example, if some of your metrics get out of line, you can do trackio.alert, which will trigger an alert not only to show up in the UI, but it'll also show up in the CLI, which is very useful again when we get down to agents. And then it also is useful, you can also connect it to Slack or Discord. And so this is useful if you're monitoring your training runs. This will kind of emit alerts there. And of course, everything that I'm describing, by the way, I don't know if I've mentioned this already, but it's completely open source and free. So you can run Trackio, unlimited runs, completely for free. Now, the other thing which is kind of nice is that in some cases, you do want to run Trackio remotely. You don't want to keep the logs locally. You want to perhaps share it with somebody else. Well, you can do that as well. And the way that works is you can deploy the log to Hugging Face spaces. And so what all you have to do is provide a space ID when you init the project. And then instead of saving the logs locally, what it will do is we'll stream the logs to this remote space. And then you can, once you have that, if it's hosted on Spaces, you can embed it in your blog, you can embed it in reports, you can do it however you want. And there's a lot more detail in the Trackio documentations here. What I want to talk about now is actually kind of using it via CLI or API or MCP server. So there's different ways to actually use the Trackio dashboard, once you've created it. And just to kind of motivate this a little bit. So suppose you run an experiment. I'm going to run, for example, let me run this experiment over here. And then you can see here, this experiment did not probably go the way I wanted. I'm going to bring the smoothing factor down. Here you can see here, there's a spike in the training loss. Now, you can observe this manually, and you can look at the other charts to understand what's happening here. But let's say you're running experiments autonomously, or you have a bunch of different metrics, and you have hundreds of charts, hundreds of runs. You want to be able to point Cloud Code at the training logs and efficiently figure out what went wrong. So Cloud Code is not great at, if you have all of these logs stored as a JSON, which is something you can fetch from Trackio, passing all of that to Cloud Code, not only is it wasteful in terms of tokens, but it's also not efficient in terms of it being able to retrieve exactly what went wrong and getting a picture of that. So instead, what you can do is you can actually use Trackio's CLI tools. So Trackio has a bunch of CLI commands built in. So not only can you, for example, list projects, get the metrics for a project, but it also has these nice commands that let you, I'm going to go down a little bit here. So you can actually get snapshots of the metrics. So you can, for example, say, I want to know all of the metrics around step 200. So it'll say Trackio, get a snapshot of this project, of this run around the time step 200, give plus or minus 5 steps and get this as a JSON, which is, convenient for my Cloud Code agent. And so this is very useful, but you don't need to memorize all of these CLI commands. Trackio comes with a skill that you can install to any coding agent very easily. So let me demonstrate that in practice, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have my coding agent analyze this training run and figure out what went wrong completely on its own. So we'll open up the terminal here. All right, so let me start by installing the Trackio skill. And so the way to do that is you just do Trackio skills, add Claude, and then -- Claude. And so what this will do is this will install the Trackio skill. If it already exists, you're gonna have to add the -- force. And this will overwrite that skill over there. And now Claude will know all about the Trackio CLI usage and some useful contextual information. So let's start Claude now. All right, so now that I've started Claude, I can go ahead and ask it, use the Trackio CLI to analyze the training project spike demo 5262333, any issues that you see. So what it's going to do, it's going to automatically pick up the fact that it has this Trackio skill installed. So let's let it figure that out. Yes, successfully loaded the skill. And then it's going to know what to do basically from here. So we can let it run. So first it's going to start by listing all of these, runs, metrics. So here, maybe I think it tried to run too many commands at the same time, but you can see here, it's listing the alerts, listing the project, and now it's starting to get, so it said no alerts were fired. Okay, so as I mentioned before, alerts can be a very powerful way to kind of debug your training run. So you can actually have Trackio set alerts. You can have Cloud Code, for example, add Trackio alerts to your training code. And this will be very useful if you want to very, very quickly, identify if a particular thing went wrong and maybe you want to interrupt the training run. So if you want Cloud Code to kind of be an orchestrator, it can listen to those alerts coming in and it can potentially, terminate a training run or change the hyperparameters and restart a training run. And now it looks like the analysis is complete. It figured out, so you can see here, it used a variety of different tools, including, getting the key statistics at different points and so on. But it found out that there's a major loss spike at step 8000. The gradient exploded, so it figured out that there's a gradient norm problem. And it even found out that the root cause was that there was a learning rate peak. So all of these, and then, it has these recommendations as well. So again, if you were doing some sort of auto research, this would be very effective, and not just searching blindly, but then actually figuring out, what went wrong, analyze the run after it's complete, adjust the hyperparameters in the right direction, and move on. So there's some kind of reasoning that's baked into here as well. So that's kind of how you use Trackio, both as a human user, via this dashboard, as well as via the CLI, as we talked about here. Hopefully that gives you an overview, and I look forward to you trying out using Trackio. It's completely open source, completely free, and I'll link to these docs on Hugging Face on how to actually set everything up and get started yourself. Thank you so much.